Hello, everyone, and welcome to a spectacular clash from round 8 of this or of today's Title Tuesday. It is Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann. Magnus not really worried about the World Cup. He already won it, and he's not really interested in qualifying for the FIDE Candidates Tournament. Hans got eliminated from the World Cup, so he has all the time in the world for Title Tuesday. As the title suggests, yes, Magnus played twice in a row or two moves consecutively. And not in a way that you might think. He didn't cheat and play two moves in a row, or if you remember how Wilson the Hustler captured two pieces at once against Maurice Ashley. No, he actually did it illegally, and in chess that is possible by employing something using something called tempi. Now we're gonna get to that, but yeah, like I said, round 8, Magnus is on a perfect score. He's on 7 out of 7. Hans was on 6 out of 6. Then he faced Hikaru. He drew Hikaru, and now he faces Magnus with black. Always, when you're good, you just get this. You face Hikaru, and then you face Magnus as black. But yeah, let's check it out. With 5-0 at this time control, playing a game this precise, this is a master class. So let's check it out. Magnus with white opens with pawn to e4. We have pawn to e5, knight f3, knight to c6, and knight to c3. We have the 4 knights, knight to f6, pawn to d4, the Scotch variation of the 4 knights, e captures, knight captures, and the bishop to b4. We have knight captures on c6, b captures, and bishop to d3. So this is all very well known, and as you can see, they're playing pretty much instantly. We have castles, and pawn to d5 by Hans. Again, all been played before. Captures, bishop g5, c6, strengthening the d5 pawn, now that the knight has been pinned. Queen f3 by Magnus, and bishop to e6 is the most regular reply here. Hans goes for pawn to h6, and Magnus says, all right, let's trade. I give up the bishop pair, but I ruin your pawn structure a little bit. So captures, and now 92. And you can see that Magnus spent only 15 seconds getting this position, as he knows it very well. He already played it. He played against Arjun. He played against Anish Giri, and but Hans also playing really fast. Hans goes rook to e8, and we have rook 8 to d1. And this is now a new move. Usually knight to g3 or knight to d4 is played. Not completely new. There is one game in the database where this has been played. It continued with bishop to c5. Also, there's one game where bishop to g4 was played. Here Hans goes for rook to b8, and it is now as of move 15 that we have a completely new game. Okay, how does Magnus go about this? He spent 20 seconds getting this position. Now he has 4 minutes and 40 seconds to play out the entire endgame. Hans a little bit less, but still over 4 minutes. b3. Okay, that b2 pawn was definitely a target, and your opponent has a dark square bishop. Well, he has a light square bishop as well, but your light square bishop can oppose your opponent's light square bishop, so it makes sense to put the pawns on light squares. We have bishop to c5 and knight to g3. Okay, Hans goes rook to e5, takes away f5 and h5 from the knight, as the bishop also controls f5. So the rook is useful there. We have h3 and king to f8. We have king to h2, unpinning from the f-pawn and preparing pawn to f4. Hans goes rook to e7, probably due to the lack of a better move. It's hard to get a nice square for that light square bishop. The rook here, unless you have time to maybe double up on the e-file or maybe play bishop b7, which doesn't seem all that useful. Hans plays rook e7, and he invites knight to f5, which means that he's willing to give up the bishop pair. And Magnus goes for it. He says, all right, if you're willing to do it, I'm not going to stop you. He does it. Bishop captures, and rook to e2. So, okay, Hans got some activity for the rook, for giving up the bishop pair. King g3, the pawn is protected, so no worries there. Rook back to e5 by Hans, and bishop back to d3. We have bishop to b4. Hans says, all right, I have full control over the e1 square. There's no way for you to ever contest my rooks on the e-file. If you go rook c1, I'm just going to put a bishop on c3. So there's no way for you to make your rooks useful. And he is correct in that regard. But Magnus plays pawn to f4, and now Hans, instead of going something like rook to e6 or rook e7, to force Magnus to figure out a way on how he's getting the rooks off the board, he makes it a little bit easier for Magnus. Plays rook e3 check. Magnus goes rook f3 and rook b to e8. Magnus, of course, would very much love getting a pair of rooks off the board. So rook captures on e3, rook captures with check, and king to g4. We have king to g7 and rook to f1. Okay, g6 is obviously out of the question. You cannot play f5. So Hans goes bishop to d6, and we have rook to f3. Magnus would very much love to trade the other pair of rooks, because then he gets his king to f5, and it's not going to be easy for Hans to play this with an inactive king. So rook to e1. Of course, Hans keeps the rooks into the game. King to f5 and the bishop to e7. We have bishop to e6. Now Magnus says, all right, I'm ready to go after those pawns. And Hans goes rook to c1, going after the c2 pawn, followed by rook to f2. Rook to c3 is also fine, but Magnus prefers rook to f2. As c5, that rook on c3 might be a target at some point. So, okay, rook back to e1 by Hans, and bishop to b7. Magnus's bishop finds some nice targets here, and Hans just defends. Rook to e6. No way to pressure them. But now Magnus plays bishop to c8. We have rook back to e3 and bishop to d7. Now you don't have the e6 square, and the rook cannot help out with the defense of the pawns, unless you play rook c3, which Hans doesn't for some reason. Instead, Hans plays pawn to c5, which seems like a great idea, as your opponent has a light square bishop, and you're going to put your pawns on dark squares. But there's an issue with this, because here Magnus plays bishop to c6. Yes, Hans does put all of his pawns on dark squares. Sorry about that. As you can see, Magnus has all of his pawns on light squares, so the dark square bishop cannot attack them. And Magnus just plays bishop to b5. Now he says, I'm going to play rook e2, I'm going to trade rooks, and then, yes, it's bishops of opposite color, it's equal material, but my king is on f5 and your king is on g7, so that is a huge difference in activity. Okay, Hans goes bishop d6, and now rook e2, where you probably shouldn't trade. If you trade, then the black king really has nothing to do, and that a white king can just march anywhere, king side, queen side, and white's position is just much better. Plus, black has a doubled f pawn. So after rook e2, rook to g3 was played, and now pawn to a4 by Magnus. Now his plan is to advance the pawn to a5 to a6, and then once it's safe on a6, go after the pawn on a7, capture it, and then you have only 2 moves to promotion. So is there anything Hans can do about this? Not really, but it's also incredibly impressive how Magnus does it. h5, a5, we have h4, pawn to a6, and now rook to g6. For the lack of a better move, I imagine the idea is king h8, and then once rook e8 check is played, you can block with rook g8, because if you go king f8, then you just kick the king back. There's really no move here for Hans. Magnus's position is just that much better with the active king on f5. So rook to e8 by Magnus, and now Hans plays rook captures on g2. And this is what I meant by the title. What do you play here? That's the question. There are a couple of ways you could go about this position, but there's one where you can actually play twice. So how do you do this? Feel free to pause the video and win the game in the cleanest possible manner for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on figuring out a way on how to play twice without cheating. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is rook to d8. Yes, rook to a8 is very nice. You will win that pawn. But the thing is, if you play rook to a8, then black is first to capture a pawn. And now look at this. Remember this position very well. This was the position where you guys started calculating. Now Magnus played rook to d8. And okay, the bishop has to move. Where can the bishop go? You can go to c7. There's no other square. So bishop to c7. Now Magnus goes rook to d7. So that's the second move with the rook. Bishop to b8. You go rook to b7. Again, attacking the bishop. Third move with a rook. And now after bishop to d6, only now you play rook captures on a7. So as you can see, the bishop ends up exactly where it started, and Magnus got 4 free moves with the rook. But basically, it's the same as if you've played twice in a row, because your rook was, after rook captures on g2 was played, your rook was here. And now you manage to get sort of rook a8, rook captures on a7, as this is the position now. So it's as if Magnus got 2 moves in a row without Hans even playing. And that is, real mastery. Once you achieve that, then you can, perform incredibly well. And yeah, after rook captures on a7, there's not all that much for Hans to do, because if he captures on c2 now, just bishop c4, and that's it. You're going to capture on f7 as well, then on f6, and then you advance the pawn. Whatever you do, like rook a2, rook captures on f7, check, you move a7, this is defended, you put the bishop on d5, you promote, all happening on light squares, nothing for Hans to do here. So Hans tried one last trick. He played rook to f2, and now it is possible for Magnus to go wrong, but highly unlikely. So even without pausing the video, I'm pretty sure you guys can win this easily. But just for fun, what do you play here? Yes, Magnus played king to e4, and he was in this position on move 47 that Hans Niemann resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. Interestingly, if you go king to g4, then after king captures on f4, it's a draw, because after king h5, you have a perpetual rook f4 check, and you have to go back and forth, back and forth. And also, as I know you guys, like this kind of stuff, rook captures on f7, if you thought of this, also works, because after king captures, you will get a bishop on c4 with check. After king g7, just pawn to a7, and there is no way to stop that pawn. Even to the point of rook captures on f4, king e6, and rook to e4 check, you will capture, and now rook to e8 is met with bishop to d5. So even that is just a8 queen, and that's it. You're going to be up a full bishop. So yeah, really nicely done. After king to e4, Hans resigned. Magnus won this game and all the games that followed, as these are Magnus's opponents. So he finishes the tournament, and interestingly, today is 11th of November, and he finishes with 11 out of 11, crushing absolutely everyone. After Hans Niemann, he defeated Alireza, he defeated Dmitry Andreikin, and he defeated Alexander Botvinnik in the final round. So yeah, winning any tournament is impressive. Winning a title Tuesday with the world elite playing with 11 out of 11, that's Magnus territory. So yeah, really hope you enjoyed it. That's how you play twice in a row, not like Wilson the Hustler. This is how you do it. Learn it, and you will be unstoppable. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Deepa Gangadaran, Udo Brandt, Leo Taruna Loomis, Edis Fair, and David Gasparian for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day. And if you want to really brush up on how to play twice in a row, first link in the description below, download Lotus Chess, and even that will be explained there. See you soon.